Um, all right, so I'm going to get started on the webinar, setting up your cap table for success. And usually how I do these webinars is I run through my slides and, if you have questions as we're going along, I sort of stop each slide and just check to see if there's any questions. Feel free to put your questions in the chat or, we're a small group, so you could even just unmute and we could talk about it live, whichever is your preference. So cap tables, a subject that is very near and dear to my heart. And I'm focusing this webinar on for founders and for startups. Okay, agenda. Here's what we're going to cover today. So, what is a cap table and why does it matter? What your cap table should capture, common mistakes that I see happen a lot, why we need a safe and convertible note ledger included in the cap table. We'll go through some horror stories. We'll talk about stock option plans, ESOPs, um, and why they are particularly confusing for cap tables. I'll talk a little bit about, so most of the start of the presentation will be about, C corporations and how to structure your cap table if you have a C corporation. I'll also touch on a little bit about LLCs and limited partnerships. Uh, and we'll talk a little bit about at the end, just best practices and so on. And then, like I said, as we go along, feel free to put questions in the chat or unmute and ask your question. But we'll probably have time at the end as well. Okay, so the first topic, first slide here. What is a cap table and why does it matter? So your cap table is a document that captures all the equity and who owns that equity in your company. So, whether it's shares of common stock, shares of preferred stock, whether you have options, convertible notes, safes, all of that should be tracked in your cap table. And at the end of the day, it shows who owns your company and who owns what percentage of your company at that particular point in time. It's very important that you have a cap table and that you keep it accurate. And these are the reasons why. When you go to raise money, it's one of the first things the investors will want to look at. They'll want to see, who owns this company and how much of the company should we sort of strategize towards, getting, like how much money should we invest and at what price to get what percentage of the company. So it's an essential document when it comes to fundraising. Due diligence, if your business ever has an exit, this is going to be one of the key documents that's scrutinized in due diligence and also one of the key documents used in the exit to work out who gets what in that transaction. The cap table is where you document your employees' equity. So if you build your business and you decide you're going to have an option pool for your employees, you'll capture those grants in the cap table. And it's really important that those grants are accurate and the vesting descriptions are accurate. And if you don't have that correctly done, your employees can get really mad and potentially sue you. Um, and it's good for the owner as well, for the founder. You need to know how much of this company do I own? I've got these investors coming in. How much is that going to dilute me and things like that? So you can track your own ownership of your company. And last but not least, legal compliance. You have to have clear ownership of the equity, and that's required under securities law. It's very important that you track it correctly and that you're not illegally selling securities or issuing securities. You have to follow the securities law when you're issuing your equity, issuing your securities, and making sure you document it correctly. And the cap table is sort of the ultimate document where you capture all that ownership. Now, I have my big red letter word statement here. A messy cap table can kill a deal. That's not always strictly true, but it certainly is a problem. So, when you're going out to fundraise, you're competing against a bunch of companies And most VCs that are looking at you, most, investors, angel investors, VC funds, they're looking at you, but they're looking at 10 other companies, and, maybe five of them do something that's very similar to what you're doing. And if you go into that process and your cap tables are like a mess, and it's doesn't correctly add up, and it's just, it can be a notch that the investors will be like, all right, well, they don't care about their cap table, then like what else don't they care about? It's just sort of, it's one thing that you can be on top of and can control and have correct. So there's not really any excuse to have a messy cap table. um Okay, so I'll just quickly check. No questions as of yet. I'll keep moving forward, but please feel free to, jump in if you have a question. Okay, what should your cap table capture? Now, there's a lot of things that your cap table should cover. And this is not sort of a perfect table here, but it gives you a pretty good overview of the main things that you want to capture in your cap table. You want to capture any of your shares of common stock, and these are usually the first thing you'll issue in your new startup. The founders will issue common stock to themselves. So I've got here in the little table, you can see it's got the instrument type, common stock, it's founder A stock, that they're the holder, and then how many shares of common stock do they have? We've got 4 million here. And at the current status of the company with the outstanding equity, that means that founder owns 50% of the company. And then, when it comes to including all the stock options and any warrants, it's fully diluted, everything's exercised and fully issued, then that would come down to 40%. Now, I should say, just as a sidebar here, if you do have a co-founder, don't split it 50-50 like this, because then if you ever have a deadlock, you'll be in a real pickle. But anyway, if that's ever a concern for anyone here, feel free to reach out. We can talk about it more, about how to structure your early equity, but just make the mental note that it's not a good idea to have two co-founders with 50-50 equity, unless there's another way that they intend to break any potential deadlocks down the road. Okay, so the common stock, that's the first thing you want to issue. People often do a stock option pool early on,
Hi,
and
Alicia. Hey, I just want to jump in.
yeah, sure.
Yeah, and so a lot of the shares has to do with each individual's personal guarantees and actual funding. And if that's 50-50, then I'm not sure how
Yeah,
you manage that when they equally put in money.
yeah. Great question. And, it's really on a case by case basis, this how you assess what the equity is going to be between co-founders. But I would say if you have a situation where everything's equal, you've put in equal capital, you're going to work equal number of hours, the IP you're contributing is equal, then I would say make sure you have your equity vested. Everybody have their equity subject to a vesting schedule. So if someone leaves early, the company is able to repurchase back their shares. And then I would also say maybe consider having, one founder, the CEO, who's going to make the decisions. Or if that's not possible, perhaps consider bringing in a third independent director. So if you ever get in this situation where there's a deadlock or a dispute between the founders, there's a third party that can help them resolve it.
Yeah, that's excellent. I think you've pointed out there are just so many different variables, and
Yeah,
it would
yeah.
be great if that we had that third director in marriages. But anyway,
Yeah, it's true. And, when founders have disputes and they have to carve up the business, I think it often feels a little bit like a divorce. So, yeah, it's just something to
yeah.
keep in mind. And, it's tough. I mean, especially, most founders do come into it equal footing, and it's very hard for one of them to say, well, I should be 55 and you should be 45. So I get it. It's not an easy it's not an easy discussion. It's sort of one of the harder discussions. But I see enough of the disputes and where it gets ugly that it's just a good idea to think it through, like that situation. And the horror scenario is, say founder B leaves in a huff and they own 50% of the company. Founder B goes off and does something else entirely. And then, founder A is kind of, they're stuck because they can't, under corporate law, they can't get anything approved because they don't control a majority of the vote. They only control 50%. They don't control 50.1% or 51%. So they can't get anything approved because founder B still owns half the company. If they didn't have it subject to vesting, they don't have any ability to like buy back founder B's shares, and founder B can cause a lot of problems and basically, just push the company into the ground. So,
Yeah, I did witness that
yeah.
where founder B was actually the labor force and
Okay.
founder A was just like gallivanting or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's sad. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. No, no problem. It's, one of the most important questions really at the end of the day. So Gerardo has a question here. How about old holders, those who left before vesting any shares? So if you have someone who's subject to vesting and they leave before their vesting schedule is done, depending on where they're at, the company can buy back the unvested shares. So how vesting is typically structured, it's not always structured, but it's typically structured with a 4-year schedule, and you have 25% is released on a 1-year cliff. And then it's monthly or quarterly after the first year. So you have to work for a whole year to get anything. And then after that, you get monthly installments or quarterly installments for the next 3 years till the 4 years is done. And then all the shares are released from vesting. So say in our scenario with founder A and founder B, so founder B leaves, founder B's got their 4 million shares. They work on the company for 3 months and then they're like, I hate this, I want to leave. And they leave, they don't get any of their shares. The company has the right to buy back those shares. Usually, in that scenario, it's either at fair market value or the price they purchased the shares for, which usually is a very low price at the start of a company. So typically, if that happens, the company can buy it back at a nominal amount. Now, say founder B stays for 2 years, and so they've got 25% vested because they stayed for their first year, and then they've got the monthly installments after that. So they're at 50%. And say at 2 years, they say, okay, I've had it. You drive me nuts, founder A. I'm out of here. Then in that scenario, they will own, 2 million shares. They've got 50%. The other 2 million shares, the company has the option to buy back. I mean, maybe founder B leaves in good terms or something, and a deal is worked out for their shares. But say they leave in a dispute, okay, they're entitled to their 2 million shares. They did work for 2 years, but the other 2 million shares, the company has the right to buy them back. And that applies to, options as well if you have employees who get granted options. Okay. Okay, Gerardo's question is here, but assuming they were bought back, how should we show this on a different tab in the cap table? So your cap table captures the most current ownership of the company. So if you've bought back the shares, you would remove them from the cap table. Uh, if you bought back all their shares, if they still own, say, in the scenario where you've bought back all their shares, they're off the cap table. In the scenario where you've bought back half their shares, they're still on the cap table for the shares they own. Now, I should distinguish, and I should have made this distinction up front. There's a difference between your stock register and your cap table. Your stock register is the document that tracks all the movement of the stock. So you'll put in there, this stock was issued with this certificate, and then, you know, then the company purchased back this portion, and you'll track all the changes in that way in the stock register in a much more detailed way. And that is an important document, but typically people just want to investors just want to look at like what you own now, and people want to look at what the status of the current ownership status of the company is, and that's the cap table. Okay, we've got a raised hand here. Uh, yeah, go ahead.
Hey, yeah. I was part of, I'm in California too, part of the whole, tech boom. And as an employee, I had some common shares, which are
Yep,
significantly different than the
the
owner
preferred.
shares.
Yeah,
But I noticed that you say common stock for the owner shares, but the
yeah,
employee shares were less than common stock somehow. I don't
mhm,
remember what it
yeah,
was. I
yeah,
had this fake certificate basically because when M&A came in, we just lost all of those rights or
yeah,
something.
yeah,
So
yeah,
you can describe, what happens in the employee pool. How do you
yeah,
compare that and their vesting schedule? How does that work?
yeah, yeah. So there's all different ways to structure for a company to structure their stock option pool. The most common way is that the stock option pool is a pool of shares that are set aside, and then the company grants options or restricted stock that relate to the shares in that pool. Now, for employees, they typically get options. So they'll be
Mhm.
granted an option, and it'll be an option to acquire shares of common stock once their vesting is complete. And most employees have that same, 4-year vesting schedule. I mean, that's a generalized statement, but that's just generally what is there. So they'll get their option. And now their option is issued to them well, when the option is issued to them, they get an exercise price. And the exercise price is the fair market value of the shares of common stock at the time of the grant. So if down the road the employees do decide to exercise their options, they'll get that hopefully cheaper price. So the idea is you issue the options, you issue it at the exercise price, that's the fair market value of that day, and the value of the company goes up. And at a certain point, the employees will be able to exercise their options and make some money on that transaction, because when they exercise their options at that price, it'll be lower than the price usually at the exit or what have you. Now, what unfortunately does happen a lot is there'll be an M&A transaction, and the price the company is sold for ends up being for less than the value of the company at the time of the exercise price.
Right.
So that's what they call being underwater. If your options are
Yeah.
underwater, it doesn't make any sense to exercise your options because you'll be
Right.
exercising them and losing money.
It
So
was post 9/11 and everything was just
yeah,
shutting down.
yeah.
So,
So yeah, unfortunately that happens a lot. And yeah, I see it all the time, unfortunately, and it's a risk. It's certainly a risk when you're an employee and you come in and a part of your pay package is equity. Sometimes it
right.
works out really great. Like just ask, the early employees at Salesforce or Facebook or
Mhm.
whatever, those people
Google.
who came in early, like they did really
Yeah.
well. But it's not always the case, and sometimes, employees just get wiped out entirely.
Yeah.
So
That's what
yeah,
happened to us.
yeah, yeah.
But okay. Well,
Yeah,
it was
yeah,
fun. It was a fun ride when it happened.
yeah. High risk, high reward, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, we have another question here from Anup. Is vesting of 4 to 5 years standard? Can we have a longer vesting period? I can't say I've seen anything for 8 years plus, but 4 years is typical for employees. And sometimes there'll be certain scenarios where the founders or the sort of key employees might be revested in certain sort of financings and things like that. But typically for employees in particular, 4 years is standard. Um, and then with founders, it's usually 4 years, and then it can change depending on what your investors want. And then I'll just also say with advisors, it's usually advisors usually have a 2-year vesting period, but that is something that's negotiated with each advisor to a startup. So okay, so yeah, I think everybody's probably had a good look at this
I have a
slide.
quick
Oh,
question about the
oh,
slide.
yep, sure.
So I had a early on client. I was trying to raise some capital,
Hmm.
and they just wanted nothing to do with safe. And I
Right.
just said, you know, you need to have some sort of collateral. You got to have some skin in the game. And he
Yeah.
just didn't want anything to do with that. Why? Why would startup companies with really strong technology, refuse a safe?
Right. Yeah, I don't know. It's a little hard to know what they were thinking. I mean, you have a company can not, they can choose to not raise money using their equity. They don't have to use their equity in that way. Safes are by far sort of the most popular way for early stage startups to raise money at the moment. Um, and VC funds generally are very comfortable with them. Angel investors are comfortable with them. They're very sort of efficient and cheap in terms of legal costs to raise money.
Right.
I guess that what the founder may have been pushing back on is safes, like all equity grants, will dilute the founders at the end of the day. So maybe that's what he was concerned about. But yes, when you
Mhm.
have a safe, it's a convertible security. So you're not granting equity up front. You're granting the right to equity down the road, a little bit like the options. Um, so SAFE stands for a simple agreement for future equity. And what it means is the investor is agreeing to come in and give a certain amount of money now, and they're going to set the valuation of the company now. So usually safes are used early on. The valuation of the company is low. So you can get as an investor, you can get a good deal. You can come in and, I mean, it's just an example, but say you invest $100,000 and the company values themselves at $2 million. So you're getting a good percentage of the company right off the bat with a relatively small investment and a low valuation. So they're very popular, but maybe your founder was like, well, I don't want to get diluted like that. It's not
Right,
worth
because
it
then
to
you
me.
become a sharecropper on your
Yeah,
own farm at
yeah,
that point.
yeah. For that
I
amount of
see.
money, I don't want to give away 5% of the company or whatever.
I
So
see.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
All
Quick
right.
question. Does it really have to be dilutive? I mean, if you actually in the cap table, if it doesn't really add up to 100% and you actually allocate about, let's say, 20%, let's say if you're a solo founder in some cases, you may not want to take 100%. You might leave a very large
Mhm.
chunk for future, perhaps co-founders coming in,
Yep,
or a technical architect or, a CTO of, and
Mhm.
yep,
if you have actually done that.
yeah,
And in this case, you could probably
yeah.
leave about 20 to 25% cap table blank. Would it have to be
Yeah,
safe at that
absolutely.
time?
Yeah, absolutely. I should say this is by no means, this is not an example of anything you should be doing. So don't use this as your cap table model. This is just to show you, like, cap tables include common stock and preferred stock and stock up. This is just to show you all the things that could be on there. But yeah, you should definitely structure your cap table for what suits you and your company. And that's like really depends on your situation. Like you were just saying, it depends on what your founders are looking for, whether you're going to bring in some key people early on who will expect, a significant chunk of the equity. You should definitely reserve that for them. Whether you're intending to raise early or you're not going to raise for a while. These are all things you should think about while while you're thinking about your equity allocation. And you should talk to your legal counsel about this and your advisors and so on. I mean, I guess, this is sort of one of the problems with using something like Clerky or Stripe Atlas, because even though they're good products and they're fine for certain situations, they don't help you analyze like what your cap table should look like. And sometimes when you go in and use those sort of automated incorporation services, they set you up with an equity structure that actually doesn't work for you. And sometimes I have people come to me and we just have to redo it all. So that's just,
I just want to jump in on that because I feel the same thing with small businesses using things like Quicken. Like they don't
uh-huh.
understand the structure of a ledger when they're dependent on these automated systems.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, I've got a question here from Dougie about, can we touch on common stock and preferred stock, please? Yeah, absolutely. Let me just quickly check the time here. Okay, I think we're doing good on time. So common stock is that is sort of, what some jurisdictions call ordinary shares, but common stock is what we generally call it in the US. And it's the the stock that is granted to founders. It's kind of the base of the company's equity. And whereas the preferred stock is what the investors get, and the preferred stock have the preferred rights. And the preferred rights that the investors typically seek are a liquidation preference. They want to be sure that they're going to get their money back if there's an exit, or at least get it back before the common stock. They'll want particular voting rights. And what else do preferred stock? There's a whole long list of rights that preferred stock gets. Right, they get right of first refusal over founders' transfers, and there's all sorts of rights that investors seek, and they're captured in the preferred stock. Anti-dilution rights is another very important one for investors. So the distinction generally is common stock for founders. Sometimes you might have some family and friends who are happy to come in on invest in common stock, but typically your investors will want preferred stock, and they'll want the preferred stock terms that come with that. Now, also just know that safes and convertible notes, they typically convert to preferred stock. The investors who come in on safes and convertible notes, they want those to convert to preferred stock at the end of the day.
Right, right. I just wanted to jump in on the preferred stock. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought because you brought up the thing that I was thinking about those things converting to preferred stock.
Yep.
Oh, but there are also federal laws that also dictate what happens to private investors, correct?
Yes, there is. There's a whole bunch of securities laws that you need to follow when you're doing a financing round. And that's like a separate 3-part webinar. But just generally know that if you're going out to investors, you need to look for people who are accredited investors. That's the easiest way to proceed forward with preferred stock financings, safe financings, convertible notes. Okay, I'm going to keep plowing forward. All right. Stock register. A quick question here from Geraldo. Is the stock registered doc where the history goes? That's right. That's where the history goes. That is assuming the restricted stock purchase agreement is executed and thus the shares are allocated to show up in the cap table. Yes, I think that's right, Gerardo. So you have the stock register document where you sort of set forth the history of all the transactions of the equity, and the cap table and the history, as you say, and then the cap table shows the ownership as of, the present ownership. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about misclassifying instruments. So this is probably one of the most common cap table errors, and it can cause a real problem. And just basically what you need to do is when you're doing your cap table, you need to make sure that you have the equity correctly described, and the name of the equity holder correct, and their number of shares that they own correct. That's the things, under law that you have to have correctly described. And in addition, you need to have, separate from the cap table, you need to have documentation to back up that grant. So if it's common stock, right, you've got your common stock line in the cap table, you've got this person owns that common stock, you've got their full name in there, and then you've got the number of common stock shares that they hold. If it's a safe, you're going to want to have that safe correctly described, and I have a slide that deals with that. But you want to have it, the amount and the investor's name and the just general terms of the safe. If it's preferred stock, you want to have the class of preferred stock correctly described, and the shareholder's name and the number of shares that they hold. Okay, so common mistakes I see. So sometimes when people go out and issue safes, those simple agreements for future equity, they go ahead and they list them as equity right in the cap table straight away. That's not correct. They're not equity yet. They're the right to get equity down the road, but they're not equity today. Same with convertible notes. Sometimes people, companies, they take a convertible note investment, and then they just go and put it in the cap table as equity straight away, like the safe. It's not equity yet. It's not preferred stock yet. It's a convertible note, and it should go on the convertible ledger along with the safes. Same problem with options and warrants. And also to this point that we've talked about a little bit, making sure you've got it clear what the vesting schedule is. So if someone does leave early, they've vested up to this amount of shares, and this amount of shares will be, either bought back by the company or just the options will be cancelled or what have you. So these are sort of common mistakes that we see. They're really important that these are cleaned up and it's clear, like I've been saying, it's clear what the type of equity is, who owns it, and how much. So the reason that this is a problem is it just basically makes your cap table inaccurate. And nobody sort of understands what's going on, and investors coming in doing due diligence don't have a clear picture of who owns what. It can also lead to disputes because the founders will, they might think they own a certain percentage of the company and it turns out they don't. And then the same with the investors. The investors might say, oh, I thought I owned this much of the company, and it turns out that they just don't. So you want to avoid those situations. And you certainly want to avoid a situation where you can be seen to be in breach of securities laws. And sort of the main concern there is if it looks like you've issued shares which you actually haven't issued. So you've taken money from someone and then you haven't actually issued the securities correctly to reflect that. That can be a problem. Okay. So to that point, you have your first page of your cap table. The best thing to do is usually just set out there and the sort of the shares, the actual shares, the common stock and the preferred stock, list that on the first table. You might want to list out your option pool as well. And then have a separate tab to reflect your current safes and convertible notes before they convert to stock. So you have a separate tab or a separate page if you're using, say, Carta or one of the Capita or one of the cap table management platforms. But yeah, have a page, a ledger where you set out, these are all the safes we have, these are all the convertible notes. And what you want to track is the investor name or the entity name, the amount that they have invested, the valuation cap, the discount rate. Now, some safes will be one or the other. You can have safes that have valuations, caps, you can have safes that have discount rates, or you can have safes that have both. And the same with convertible notes, although most convertible notes have both. They usually include both concepts. You want to be clear if it's a pre-money or post-money safe valuation cap. Include the date of execution. Make a note if there's an MFN clause, and pro rata rights. Make a note if there's pro rata rights, because you don't want to forget to make sure you offer those safe holders their pro rata rights down the road if they have them. And very similar for
Can
convertible
you
notes.
can you touch on the benefits, pros and cons of pre versus post money?
Yes. So, this is a thing people think about a lot. At the end of the day, I mean, I don't know, maybe it's unfair of me to say. I don't think it makes that much difference at the end of the day. But post money is generally preferred for safes because it's very clear on what you own. So there's a very simple calculation of what an investor and the company can work out if they have a post-money safe, which is you take the post-money valuation and you take your investment amount and you divide it by the post-money valuation amount, and you come up with, that's generally the percentage of the company you will own post-conversion, but pre the next financing round, if that makes sense. I know it's a little abstract. And then with pre-money, some founders prefer pre-money because it gives them a little bit more flexibility on how much of the company that they have given away, for want of a better phrase. So when you have the pre-money, the safe is converted without including it's converted at the pre-money valuation without including the amount of the safe or the convertible notes that are outstanding. So it's often a little harder for the investors to figure out what they actually own, and it can give the company a little bit more flexibility. Some people think there's a big benefit in that. Personally, I think the confusion that pre-money safes cause, any benefit you get from them is outweighed um, by the confusion that they cause. But people have different opinions on that. But it all comes down to the conversion calculation and what percentage of the company the safe holder will ultimately have post conversion, but prior than the next round of money coming in. So usually safes convert at the next equity financing round. So it's the amount they convert to before that next financing round, but after they've converted. And sorry, that's probably as clear as mud, but anyway. um, okay, I've got a question here. Ankit, yes, if anyone would like a copy of the slides, feel free to reach out to me. I'll share my email and you can email me and I'll send you a copy. Okay, Androlda has a question on the vesting schedule changes. Some corporate law professionals tell solo founders their initial vesting dates can be reset. Yes, that's correct. I mean, if you're a solo founder, you may not even want to do vesting up front. You can just hold off on the vesting until an investor asks for it. Or you can enter into a restricted stock purchase agreement off the bat. And and then if an investor wants you to reset it down the road, you can do that. Just remember your 83B elections if you do that. And you can ask your attorney or you can ask me separately how to do that. Okay, I'm going to move on. Neja, if you could email me, because I don't have the chance to write your email down at the moment, but I'll share my email. If you email me, I'll send you the slides or reach out to me on LinkedIn, either or. Okay, some safe horror stories. So these are a few things about why it's really, these examples sort of point to why it's important to have that correct safe ledger. So the first one is sometimes founders get really excited. They have all these investors who want to invest in them and they go and enter into all these safes and they forget to actually model out what it will look like when these safes are converted and you're diluted. So yeah, that's the horror scenario that the founder issues all these safes, comes time to convert the safes, all of a sudden they're diluted down to nothing. And they're like, what? How did this happen? So it's a really good idea to keep that ledger, keep it correct, and keep modeling out for yourself what it's going to look like post dilution. Number two is a horrible one. It's so simple to make this mistake, especially if, say, you got a whole bunch of angel investors. You've got a lot of people investing 5K or something, and one of them gets missed off the list. They could be lost forever, and that can be a real problem down the road when that angel investor sues you because they got missed off the cap table and they didn't get the money in the exit, and everybody's mad and everybody's upset. So don't do that. It's a simple mistake, but it can cause a real problem. And yeah, I mean, again, this one down the bottom here, also a simple mistake. Just, using some sort of modeling tool and putting in the wrong figures and coming up with the wrong result can make a real mess. So just be careful when you're doing the modeling. Okay, ESOPs. Just check where we are on time. Okay, yep, we've got plenty of time. So we've talked about this a little bit. So ESOPs are often a real problem when it comes to diligencing cap tables. So you want to make sure when you set your option plan up that you do it all correctly and that you have a share reserve that makes sense for your business and your sort of plans for the employees you have coming in and, who you intend to grant options to and so on, or, employees and advisors or directors and so on. At certain points in the sort of for the ESOP, you'll need the stockholder approval up the front when you're putting the ESOP in place and the reserve in place. And generally speaking, when you go to change the pool, you'll need to get the stockholders to approve that other things with the options the board can approve, like the 409A valuation. So I talked about this a little bit before, but when you go to grant options or restricted stock or what have you, you need to set the value of that equity. For the restricted stock, it's the purchase price. For the options, it's the exit price. That has to reflect the fair market value. Now, the easiest way to do this is just to get a 409A valuation, and then that is something you can rely on. Carter offers 409A valuations with their cap table management services. A lot of the other cap table management services do as well. You can also use independent valuers to come up with 409As. And that's just a helpful thing to have the valuation properly set. At the end of the day, the board has to approve the valuation for the options. And then, so you've got your 409A valuation, you've got your people you want to grant options to, and then you just need to make sure it's all properly documented. And this is where I see a lot of mistakes. People don't get the board, they don't get the board approval for the grants, and then down the road, it becomes apparent that the options weren't properly granted, and then those employees didn't have the options that they thought they had. So just keep in mind with options, the options are not granted until the board has approved the grant and the board has approved the 409A valuation. And the problem can be, if you don't, actually, maybe I touch on that on the next slide. But anyway, that's what you need to do. You need to have the board properly approve everything and have everything properly documented. And when you go for your big round of financing or your M&A transaction, investors will go through and they'll check. They'll make sure they'll have their lawyers check that every grant was properly done. Because if the grants weren't properly done, that employee might sue. And that's, a risk that they need to be aware of, potential liability that investors want to be aware of.
If you don't mind me asking, sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
This is in the case of ESOP, but if you're trying to give a restricted stock unit as such, RSUs, do you still need a board approval for that, or is that something that can be done a part of the package?
Yeah. RSUs need to be properly approved as well. Yeah, and they similarly need to be set at the fair market value.
Got it.
Depending on the terms of your plan, but that's generally speaking. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, and you want to track your vesting as well, whether it's for options, RSUs, restricted stock, what have you. Okay. Horror stories. So I see, it's very common to have problems with the ESOP because people, they're running their business, they're trying to keep their employees happy. They might promise them some options and then kind of forget about it. Or they might onboard someone and they've got options in their package and it just kind of slips through the cracks that they forget to get it properly approved. And this, falls through the cracks. No one really remembers about it. The employee just assumes they have their options. It comes time to do your Series A or what have you. The investors council's going through everything and they see that the options weren't properly approved. And now they're like, okay, you got to get these options properly approved now. Well, the fair market value has shifted. So when, say, that employee started 2 years ago, they thought they got their options 2 years ago. Now they have to get them properly granted. The fair market value has changed. The employee is getting a much higher exercise price. There's nothing you can do to correct this. It just is what it is. And that makes people really mad. So best to just have a good process in place with your options. Talk to your attorney about it. Talk to me about it. Just have a policy in place to have the options properly issued every time. And there's different services that can help you with that. The 409A valuation. So, I usually strongly advise people get 409As. You don't technically need to get one. What you technically need to do is the board needs to set the fair market value price. Now, the board the best way for the board to do that is to rely on a 409A valuation, so they got something to back up their assessment. But say they didn't do that. Say the board just decided this is what our value is, and we're just going with this. We're not going to pay for a 409A valuation. If it turns out, if there's an audit down the road by the IRS and it turns out that valuation was wrong, there's penalties and the employee has to pay the penalties. And again, that makes for mad employees. So it's just something to think about. Okay, I'm going to quickly, if anyone has any questions, feel free to jump in. Otherwise, I'm going to quickly talk about other entities and just things you need to think about. Okay, so not every startup is a C Corp. Sometimes people use LLCs. It's pretty rare to see LPs, but limited partnerships sometimes are there. Now, if you have an LLC, your cap table is going to cover different things because the equity is different. You're going to have, for LLCs, you're either going to have membership interests or units. And you can be very creative in how you structure your LLC units and membership interests. All that will be documented in your operating agreement. And you can get very creative with your equity incentives. Like instead of having a stock option plan, you can do things with profits interests, or you can create a special class of units for your employees and things like that. Now, I will say with LLCs, most institutional investors do not want to invest in an LLC. They want a C Corp. So usually what happens is if you have a startup that starts as an LLC, if you're going to bootstrap forever, that's fine. And it may be preferable because you can get particular tax treatment that might be more beneficial to you. Similar with the limited partnership, but 9 times out of 10, 99% of the time, if you have an institutional investor, VC fund, angel investor, they're going to want to invest in a C Corp and get the benefits of that for them, which is most notably the QSBS. But there's other reasons as well. So yeah, just keep that in mind that if you do have an LLC, you still need to have a cap table. It just looks different, covers different things. Okay, so we'll finish off with some sort of best practices and things you should do. So I would just say keep the cap table correct from the start or clean it up early. The longer you leave it a mess, the harder it is to fix. And it's a tough thing to fix while you're doing a financing round, and it's even harder to fix while you're doing an M&A exit. So some to-dos: audit your cap table against the signed docs. For every entry in your cap table, you should have a package of documents to back it up. Back up that grant, whether it be a grant of common stock, preferred stock, SAFEs, what have you. So make sure you've got all that documentation, it's signed and dated. Make sure you have your SAFE ledger, your SAFE and convertible note ledger, and it sets forth each of those items. Make sure you've got all the correct board approvals. Every grant should be approved by the board for whatever equity it is, and sometimes you need stockholder approval as well. Confirm that you've got the 409A and it's correct. The 409A matches the relevant option grant or the relevant restricted stock, what have you. Make sure everything's signed. So often I go in and look at a company on behalf of an investor and I see half the documents aren't signed. We're like, it's not to say that a document that's not signed can never be enforceable, but it's a lot harder to make, you're in court arguing why it should be enforceable. Just have your documents signed and dated. If you have employees and founders that depart, update the cap table immediately. Get that paperwork sorted out and correct. And play around with the modeling for your rounds and so on, your future rounds that you're planning, so you can get an idea of what you're willing to sort of give up or grant in the next round and so on. Okay, there's a bunch. You don't have to do all this cap table management alone. You can work with your lawyer to do it. or you can use one of these services. There's a whole bunch of different cap table management tools. Carta is very popular. Capita is a new one in the market. Capita, sorry, not Capita. Capita. They're nice people there. They're new to San Francisco. Pulley's another one that's been around for a little while. Angel List as well, and JP Morgan provides a cap table management service for certain startups, and so does Fidelity. There's a whole bunch of different options, and you can do it yourself on an Excel spreadsheet, but that's error prone. Sort of proceed with caution. But if you're good at maths and you're good at tracking these things, then that could be the way to go. Okay. So Dougie has a question. Would a lawyer normally set up and help you manage the cap table? So yeah, I often, with most of my clients, how we do it is I usually recommend they use one of these tools, and then I work with them to make sure it's correct. And then I help them with those steps that we sort of listed on the cap table, sorry, on the slide before. So, we'll use one of these services here to sort of streamline it a little bit and make it easier for their team to manage the cap table, but then we'll go in and check it for them. That's usually how we do it. Now, we don't have to do that. We can manage the entire cap table for the client. It's just that's more expensive, to be honest. So, and a little less user friendly. Okay. Key takeaways. Let's see where we're at. Yep, we've got 5 minutes left. Okay. So your cap table is a living document. It's going to be moving. It's not going to stay stagnant, most likely. You want to keep it clean, keep it up to date. You want to make sure you've got your instruments classified correctly. Remember that safes and convertible notes are not equity until they convert. Keep that convertible instrument ledger. Make sure you follow the process with the stock options, and just have a good policy in place on how you want to deal with stock options for your company. Model out the dilution so you know like where you're going and what's going to happen. And to the extent you want to use cap table management software, work with your legal counsel. If you're going to be raising money or looking to do an M&A exit down the road, it's essential that you have this correct. Okay, so that's it.